Welcome to the Hey Chaplain podcast. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. Hey Chaplain is an officer wellness podcast produced for cops and covers topics like your career, your wellness, and law enforcement culture. On Hey Chaplain, you'll hear from dispatchers and federal agents, sheriffs, and U.S. Marshals, as well as the occasional South African police chaplain. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain share their hard-earned wisdom so that police officers everywhere can survive and thrive. Let me tell you a secret. The podcasting gig is not really that glamorous. The special perks are few and far between. But this summer, I had one of the best treats ever when my friend Stephen Keogh from Scotland Yard sent me an advance copy of his next book. I've never had a chance to read an advance copy of a book before it was published. It's kind of like getting to be in on a secret. And so I was doubly excited because this particular book is one part history, one part modern true crime with kind of a Sherlock Holmes sort of flavor to it. It's called Murder Investigation Team, Jack the Ripper. Stephen, who was a Scotland Yard detective in London, reinvestigates the serial murder crime spree of Jack the Ripper and compares and contrasts how that investigation in 1888 was done compared to how Scotland Yard would pursue it today. Stephen gives a really satisfying analysis of what happened, which murders were actually committed by the same serial killer, how police leadership got in the way of the investigation, and what motivated Jack the Ripper to kill his victims in the way that he did. It's really good. Here's Stephen Keogh. Hello, Steve. How are you today?
Hi, Jared. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad to get to talk to you. You've been on my mind a lot because I've been reading your new book and really enjoying it.
Oh, that's good. I appreciate that. Thank you. You're one of the very few to have read it. There aren't that many that have read it.
No, this is really kind of a first for me where I got an advanced copy of a book that had not yet been published. I was really excited about it. So I had the PDF on my phone, and every night I'm reading chapter after chapter, couldn't put it down.
I appreciate that.
It was really exciting.
Cool.
The title of the book is Murder Investigation Team, Jack the Ripper. And so you're going way back.
Yeah. I mean, you can't really go much further back in terms of looking at crimes because you're not going to have any of the information. So going back to that sort of late 19th century is as far back as you could probably go and have the information that you can actually make sense of what's going on, if you know what I mean. Yeah,
you need a time for the different police agencies, wherever you look, in this case, Metropolitan Police, you need a time for them to build up enough bureaucracy that they're keeping records.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And the newspapers and the press reports and everything. So, yeah, it was a bit of a sweet spot, really, when it first... So I mean, I don't want to go off on tangents here, but I'll talk about it in the book. In the UK, it was around the time when literacy was really kind of taking off and full-time education was mandatory for children. So the literacy rate in the UK was much higher than it was, say, 20 years before. So newspapers were really starting to blossom, and new ones were coming out every day, but you know what I mean. So it was a time when there was much more information around to be able to ascertain exactly what was going on there.
For somebody who maybe they've heard the name Jack the Ripper, but they have only the vaguest concept of what happened. I mean, for me, I knew that I think I was pretty aware that there were a handful of murders against prostitutes by an unknown assailant. I think that was the limit of my knowledge before I read the book. So give me kind of a summary of what we're talking about with a book about Jack the Ripper.
Jared, listen, I've got to be honest, I didn't have much more information than that before I started researching it. Yeah, I didn't. So just briefly how it came about, I dabbled in a bit of YouTube when I retired from the police. And a lot of my subscribers were American. And they kept asking me about Jack the Ripper. So I thought, well, I'll look into it. I'll look into what it is and try and put some videos up about it. And it just really, really got my interest. And so essentially what it was is, certainly in the UK, probably the world really, it was the first ever known serial killer that really caught the imagination and newspapers, etc. And it was a series of murders in one very small, tight area of East London known as it's called Whitechapel. So when these murders first started to happen, they kind of went a little bit under the radar, and there was a bit in the news. But as they started more and more of them, and in the end, there were 11 murders that were linked within what's called the Whitechapel murders, and that's the police file, if you like, that existed of these 11 murders. And within there are a number of murders that can be attributed to a man who became known as Jack the Ripper.
Do you have an idea of how many murders, how well were the crime stats being kept in London at that time? Do we know approximately how many murders a year were happening total?
Yeah, I've seen mixed on these because there's nothing official. It's more people going through records and that. And they talk about 80, potentially 80 a year, which isn't massively different from now. In London, actually, we're looking at around about 120 murders a year, which for a major city is actually quite low, I think. Yes. Certainly compared to some of US cities, definitely.
These particular murders, they stood out in part because of the climate with the newspapers and the attention it was getting, but also because the murders were increasing in severity. The actions taken against these women got more and more gruesome with each murder. At least there seemed to be a trend, right? And that also caught people's imaginations and stoked their fear.
Yeah, they were brutal murders. And of those 80 murders that happened within that year, the majority of them would be run-of-the-mill murders, stabbings, strangulation, etc. What we were seeing here was something new, and it went beyond the murder. It was then going into the mutilation of bodies, etc., which is something that people weren't used to. So one of them was bad enough. And when you've got 2, 3, 4, you can imagine that the hysteria, and they were happening within quite a short space of time from each other. So the first one was in August and the last one was in November. The main ones, the one that the people really attribute to Jack the Ripper. So they're happening, the frequency of them, the veracity of them, the tight location, everything was generating this fear within this small part of London.
Yeah. Boy, and it is interesting, too, the way you lay it out, carrying us from one crime scene to the next, dealing with different witnesses and that kind of thing. It really was compelling. It sucked me right in, and I really enjoyed it.
I appreciate that. So one of the things that I wanted to do was, loads of people have written about Jack the Ripper. There are loads of books about it. So I was coming at a different angle in one way anyway, because I was looking at it from a more modern perspective as a murder investigator. But also as well, what all these books do is they just tell you what happened. And what I wanted to do was show it from the perspective of the people that was there. Now, obviously, you can't speak to them. So we still have it now. But at that time, there was a coroner's inquest. So in the UK, a coroner is different to in the US. So for us, a coroner is a kind of judge that sits in a special court that sole purpose is to ascertain a cause of death. So I know coroners are like pathologists, we call them here, don't we, in the US? Right. But in the UK, a coroner is like a kind of judge. And they have an inquest, and we still have it now, but back then it was completely different. It was more like a trial. So within a couple of days, 2-3 days, maybe a week of a murder, it was almost like a trial was taking place. But it wasn't to find someone guilty, it was to establish a cause of death.
And the newspapers could attend this and report on it.
Exactly. And the newspapers of the day then were different to ours today. So they would record a witness's evidence almost verbatim. So you got a really good understanding of what they were saying that show that these are real people that were affected by what went on there. So you've obviously got the victims of the murder, but anybody that's caught up in a murder, anyone that witnesses it or is any part of it, that's real to them. So I wanted to give their account as a first person kind of narrative. So you understand that these are real people that are being affected by it, not just me saying, on this day, this happened. You know what I mean? To me, that was boring. Right. I wanted it to come from them. And at the same time, kind of give a little bit of flavour of what it was like living in London at that time and the struggles and the different personalities and everything. So that was important to me.
Well, you did that very effectively as far as recreating dialogue and the manners of speech that different people would have, police officers, prostitutes, business owners, that kind of thing. You did a fantastic job of recreating that. Where did that come from? How did you manifest this? Is kind of an artistic thing to be able to recreate that dialogue. How did you do that?
I appreciate it, Jared. So to me, it was just trying to step inside them as people and understand if I'm a prostitute, I'm going to speak different to if I'm a landlord of these houses. You know what I mean? So everybody speaks different, and then within that, everybody's got their own personalities. So some people who are in a monologue might be they're actually quite nice people. Others they might not be. So I just wanted to make everybody, and it's difficult because it's a very short excerpt that I'm getting from them. So it's not. It might
just
be
a little
page.
vignette. Yeah,
exactly. So to try and get their personality across in that short time was a little bit of a challenge. That's what I wanted to do. So everybody was different. So when you look back and think about, say, you're looking at Mary Jane Kelly's murder, you think, oh yeah, that was such and such that told me about that. That's what I wanted to try and generate, rather than, as I say, me just recounting some facts to you, which everybody can do and has been done many, many times.
Well, you proved something I've always believed, that cops are good communicators. And you were a murder detective in London. You've actually patrolled in this same part of town, right?
Yeah, so my inspiration for the book, the lead investigator was a man by the name of Frederick Aberline, and he was a detective inspector at Scotland Yard investigating murders. I finished my career as a detective inspector. Prior to me doing that, I worked in the Whitechapel area, and prior to Aberline going to Scotland Yard, he worked the Whitechapel area. Prior to that, we both investigated terrorism. For me, it was Islamic. For him, it was Fenian, the Irish terrorists. So our careers just took this really, really sort of similar path, which is then what's got my brain ticking around. Well, what would I do in his place? What would I do now? How would that differ? And that was really where the book came from. It was me just trying to think about Aberline and, well, what was he like and how would he have approached it? And that's where the book stemmed from.
When I read about Aberline, is that really you coming through? Is that Stephen Keogh?
The very last, the epilogue with him.
Yeah.
So all of his dialogue, every single bit of his dialogue is from a newspaper interview.
Really?
Yeah, every single bit of it. Yeah, apart from him opening the door and welcoming the reporter and that kind of thing.
Right.
Everything he said about the case is from a newspaper interview. So I've not put the words in his mouth. So when he talks about the investigation and the challenges they had, and so, for instance, like, I really warmed to him. I really, really did.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I suspected you had. Yes.
Yeah, I really did. So this wasn't me putting words in his mouth. This was him. When you're in the police, every time you're doing a job, investigating murders or investigating serious crime, you're a crime scene, whatever it is, you know you're going to do long hours. You're going to come on suddenly, instead of doing your 8 hours, you're doing 16 hours and beyond.
Yeah.
So he was working really, really long hours, and in the early hours, rather than going home, he was wandering the streets of Whitechapel, not only hoping to bump into Jack the Ripper, but when he come across these women that he knew were likely to be the victims. So what these women were doing, even though they knew the dangers and they understood that they were out selling themselves to men that could turn out to be Jack the Ripper, they didn't have any choice. There was no welfare, or the unemployment rate was really, really high. The jobs weren't there, and the jobs that were there were really, really hard. So they weren't turning to prostitution because it was easy. They were turning to prostitution because they had to. They were mostly doing it just to get a roof over their heads, just for that night they could find somewhere to sleep. So Aberline, not only was he out in the early hours after work looking for Jack the Ripper, when he was coming across these women, he was giving them money so they wouldn't be in danger, so they could go and get their heads down and stay in one of their common lodging houses, which I just find like, that's so warming, isn't it? Like, not only is he determined and everything, and is obviously a really good detective, he was actually really, really caring, and he was out there and doing his bit to try and help these women, and everything I read about him just made me really warm to him.
Yeah. So let's talk about the investigation, both at the time in 1888 and also your analysis of how it would have been conducted now. When you're looking at Jack the Ripper, what assumptions were made that kept them from making progress on this case?
So yeah, I think one of the biggest assumptions that they made was who they were looking for, or the type of person they were looking for. I think we've got a much better understanding now of serial killers. But back then, when they were presented with these crimes that they hadn't seen before, and the ferocity, the violence, the mutilations, who's going to do that? Well, it's got to be a lunatic. It's got to be someone who's mad. So they were fixating on somebody who was basically running around the street foaming at the mouth almost. That's what that's the image that they created. So they spent a lot of times, they called them lunatic asylum back then. Obviously not politically correct now to call them that. But so they would trawl the lunatic asylums looking for people who'd been recently released, who may have escaped. They were looking for people out of the ordinary. So, for instance, at one stage, if the Americans listening, there was a travelling cowboy show in London at the time. So they focused on them because it's like, well, it can't be a normal person. Cowboys.
It must be cowboys.
Must be cowboys. Yeah. To me, if you're mistaking who you're looking for, that can't help, can it? It can't help you. Because you can easily dismiss somebody because they don't fit what you believe you're looking for. So that was one of the aspects that I kept seeing repeated through the police reports that I was reading about how they were fixating on a lunatic as opposed to what we know now. We're probably looking for someone completely normal.
Something that we understand better now is a motive for an action, for a crime, that you call the pull of emotion.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is, or maybe give me an example or two?
Yeah, so I've got my own thoughts on why people kill, and I boil it down really simply into human beings and what drives us. So as human beings, when we act, when we choose to do something, we're doing it because of what we feel, what we want to feel, or the benefit we're going to get. So whatever, be it exercise, whatever you do, you're doing it because of how you feel, how you want to feel, or the benefit you're going to get. And that's the same with murder. So when you're talking about revenge, jealousy, anger, they're feelings that you feel. They're driving you. So I call it a push of emotion.
Yeah.
And robbery, terrorism, a hitman, looking to up your credibility on the street, you're killing for the benefit you get from it. Mm-hmm. So I think as detectives back then, they had a good understanding of the motives that were a push of emotion, which was your jealousy, your revenge, and that kind of thing. They fully understood that. They also understood the gain. They understood robbery. But what they couldn't seem to get their head around and understand is why someone would kill just because it would make them feel something, be it power, control, sexual gratification, enjoyment, whatever it is. That's what they couldn't get their head around. They couldn't quite understand why someone would do it for that reason, and that's another thing that wasn't helping them find him because they couldn't quite understand why he was doing it.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I really, especially as you unfolded it, murder after murder, line of investigation after line of investigation, you helped kind of unpack this step by step, and I was feeling the same urgency as the book progressed. I'm like, come on, guys, just you're missing an entire way of looking at this, and you're never going to solve it, which I knew they weren't going to solve it. But it was so frustrating. So if you're looking at it now and you have all these modern tools, which you also lay out in the book, if someone's reading your book, they're going to learn about Jack the Ripper, but they're also going to learn about how a murder investigation happens now, and about things like CCTV, closed circuit television, and DNA, and canvassing a neighborhood, and all the different kind of things that a modern police force uses. Obviously, they did not have DNA, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, they couldn't test blood and things like that the way we can now.
No.
But they did have some tools. So what, to you, was the most frustrating shortcoming of their investigation? What
I didn't want to do is come along and be this smart ass that's coming along and saying... So in terms of, like, you're right, they didn't have DNA. They didn't have fingerprints. Fingerprints in the UK was the first conviction was, I think it was 1902, so about 14 years later. So they didn't have that. So you can't be critical of them not knowing what they didn't know. But where I found myself being critical was them misusing or not using tools that were open to them. So, for instance, photography.
Yeah.
Photography at a crime scene is so important. And I think the majority of your listeners who are law enforcement will fully understand that you have to photograph a scene. for many reasons, or two real reasons. One is the integrity. So when I turn up, what does it look like? What exhibit is where? Where's the body? Where's the blood stain? So that later on, when we go to court, and everything we do in law enforcement is with an eye on court, because there's no point in turning up at a murder scene and doing half a job, because by the time you get to court, your case will be thrown out because you haven't done it properly back then. So we understand.
It's no good if you understand it, if the jury will never understand it.
No, exactly, and that's the next point. So the first is integrity, and the next point is to make it clear, because how many people can get into a crime scene? You're talking, you might have your CSI, your detectives, the first responders. What about the jury or the lawyers at court, the judge? Everybody that later on needs to understand what's gone on in the crime scene. The way they do that is photography. They didn't do that until, so where I talk about 11 murders on the Whitechapel investigation, until the 7th murder, they didn't photograph a crime scene. And it wasn't as if photography was new to them. They'd had it for decades. So that I found myself critical there, because I was frustrated, because I'm thinking it's such an obvious point and you're missing it. And I was frustrated thinking, just photograph the scene. And the same as you are.
Has anyone given you a justification for why they failed to do this? I mean, it wasn't just one time. They failed to do it like half a dozen times.
Exactly.
So what went wrong?
I think it boils down to the infancy of. So the Metropolitan Police was formed in 1829, and this is 1888. So in relative terms, it was a young organisation. Detectives were even later than that. They were in 49. So less than 40 years. Detectives have been around. The Criminal Investigation Department, sort of as is now, it's a similar sort of structure, hadn't been introduced to 1878. So just 10 years before. And I think probably they didn't do it properly in the previous murders, but it was never highlighted because it was never this. They never had the magnifying glass on them as they did then. And one of the things, and I'm sure you picked up on this, Jared, as you go through, is what heartened me. As much as I'm digging them out now about not taking photography, what you see as each crime progresses is they add a little bit more to their investigation, and it's like they're learning, and you see the learning process, so that by the time we get to that 7th murder, what you're witnessing there is much closer and almost mirrors what we would do now at a crime scene. And I found that quite heartening. It was like, as frustrating as it is at the beginning, you see they're learning. And I think as police officers, we tend to be, not always, we tend to be quite good at learning from mistakes. So a lot of our good practice is born out of where we got it wrong in the past. Yeah. Quite often in high-profile cases where someone comes along and says, well, you didn't do that very well, did you? And you go, well, no, we didn't, did we? We'll have to improve that.
Yeah, if they had gotten lucky and caught Jack the Ripper by just sheer luck, it might have been an even slower progression to professionalize some of these standards.
100%.
Because there wouldn't have been the pressure to do
Exactly. You probably would have got there, but much slower. They didn't catch Jack the Ripper. We know that. But that learning in that short space of time, in those few murders, undoubtedly, in my mind, would have later on resulted directly in killers being caught, killers being convicted. And Scotland Yard ended up with a well-renowned name, if you like, and became sort of associated with good practice in murder investigation. And I think a lot of that stems from what was learned in these murders. So yes, they ultimately failed, but they learned. And I think they then put that into practice later on. And I look at what we do today, and a lot of it, I can look back at previous murders and think, well, I can see the learning. I can see how we now do it now, and you build on it, don't you? I think that's anything in life, isn't it?
Well, I even try to encourage young police officers in their career. I'm like, look at it like this: you either win or you learn.
Yeah.
And so don't. I know you've got a frustrating situation, and maybe you're gonna be punished for something, or gonna be set back for a year or two. But look at it as an opportunity to learn, because that's how we mature as humans. Yeah.
So there was one particular. So you call it canvassing, is that right? And we call it house to house. I think they call it canvassing.
Yes.
So there was one particular
going door to door to interview people, and find witnesses and that kind of thing. Yes.
Yeah. So there was one. It was the third or fourth murder, and one of these inquests at the coroner's court was taking place, and there was an inspector who was given evidence, and he was asked about his house to house, door to door, and he said, "We knocked at a few houses in the street where the murder happened," and they were like, "A few? Why haven't you knocked at them all?" And he said, "Well, I'm sure if they had anything to say, they would come forward." Which, like, well, no, mate, no. It doesn't work like that.
No, probably never has. No,
it doesn't, does it? We know, like, people aren't just, I mean, some people come forward, but there's many reasons why those other residents in those other houses wouldn't have come forward. They might have been waiting for the police to knock on the door. They might have not realised what they saw was important. There's all sorts of reasons why someone wouldn't come forward. And he got his chewed. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
and I've been in that position. I've been stood in court and I've made a mistake, and I'm standing there, and the clever defense lawyer is making me look like an idiot, and I'm standing there thinking, I am never going to make this mistake ever again. And the very next murder, they had 2 officers assigned purely to do house to house, and they had a special book that was given to them to record everything that they found. Which
do it systematically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so within the space of one murder, because this inspector got his butt kicked in court, they've suddenly moved on, and they've done the next one. They're doing it properly and very much mirrors what we do today. As I say, we're good at learning, and you're especially good at learning when you put in that position. You think, I'm never doing that again, and that was really heartening to see. I got to say,
when you added to each murder an element of modern investigation, were you committed to a certain order that you were going to introduce those, or did you just match them up to the murder? Yeah,
I tried to match them to the murder. I tried to think which one would. I mean, obviously, there are a couple where you could go where you could fit it with either.
But it came out very naturally. It was really good. I'm like, man, this is convenient that it's just falling into place like this.
Yeah, and I tried to do that.
Really good.
And it's a balance as well. So I could have gone into much more detail around these, but a lot of the people who are going to pick the book up and read it aren't going to be that much interested in the minutiae of how we currently investigate murders.
Right.
So I'm giving them almost bullet points, and a murder investigator could pick it up and say, well, actually, you haven't mentioned this. Well, there's lots I could have mentioned, and I had to. Yeah. There's a balance between a few things, really. There's a balance between those fictional character types, talking about the past, comparing it to now, talking about how we did it now. And there's a real balance to trying to get everything so you're not going over on one to compare to another. Do you know what I mean? And that was my biggest challenge, I think.
Let me ask about one more area of failure, and that was some of the leadership at the very top. At this time, the Metropolitan Police did not necessarily have leaders who were themselves police officers or career law enforcement people. Where did executive leadership interfere and get things wrong and slow things down?
Yeah, so I've got a few examples of that. So to put it into context, so the top officer in the Metropolitan Police then and now is known as the Commissioner. At the time, it was Commissioner Warren.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a police officer. He was a soldier. And that was really common then. So rather than working your way up through the ranks, you would swoosh in right at the top. And he was an officer in the engineers. And so I think he spent his time surveying rocks.
Yeah.
And I think he did a bit of archaeology. So this is his experience. And he comes in and he's in ultimate charge. A good leader has to show a bit of humility, I think, especially when the people you lead, and this is quite often the case, the people you lead know more about the job they're doing than you do. But being an arrogant army, I'm not saying, but a British army officer from the 1880s, so we haven't got any of them listening, have we? but you can imagine, can't you? They were like they came from a certain section of society. They'd spent all their military career, everyone sort of bowing down to them almost. So he's swooshed in, he's leading the police. But rather than showing that humility and realising that I haven't got the experience, the people I'm leading have, he was, no, I'm not that man. I know better than all of them. So, for instance, him and his people around him made the decision they were not going to engage with the press, the newspapers. Nothing to do with us. We're not going to talk to you. We're not going to give you any information. That's it. And today we know the importance of a media strategy and using the press and the media to put the information out so you can get your witnesses' information, whatever it is. But they didn't have that. So because of that decision, so if I was to ask you or your listeners to describe what Jack the Ripper looked like, I think there's a very good chance somebody would mention a black shiny bag.
Yeah, a doctor's bag.
A doctor's bag, yeah. And it's a really good story as to how this came about. So during the sixth murder, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Stride was murdered in a street called Burner Street. And there was a lady by the name of Fanny Mortimer who lived in Burner Street. And shortly after the murder, around the time it would have happened, a man come running past her house and he was carrying a black shiny bag. So someone running away from the murder scene, you're going to think that's going to be our killer. So that was the first assumption, that the murderer's run off, and he's carrying this black shiny bag. Now, because the press were kept at arm's length, their journalists swarmed the area looking for any sort of kind of information they had to fill their headlines. And they spoke to Fanny Mortimer, who said, "Yeah, I saw this man running away, and he was carrying a black shiny bag." So they ran with that story, and that was the headline, and the pictures that were drawn at the time all had Jack. He wasn't known as Jack the Ripper then, but the killer was carrying this black shiny bag. In the meantime, a fella saw this headline and thought, "Oh, that's me. That was me running past." And he went into the police station. He said, that man that woman saw running past with a black bag, that was me. And in that black bag was empty cigarette boxes. And the police checked it out, and they were happy. They were happy that he was that man running by, so they could eliminate him from their inquiries. Now, because they didn't engage with the press, what they should have done is gone to them and said, "That man, we found him, he's eliminated, we don't have to worry about him, we can forget about the man with the black bag."
That would be a press conference the same day in a modern police force.
Exactly. But no. So they left it, and the story ran, and still 130 plus years later, people still associate Jack the Ripper with a black shiny bag based on what Fanny Mortimer saw.
Yeah.
And it could have been nipped in the bud. You can't get a better example of what happens when you make faulty decisions around that kind of thing. And to me, it was just a prime example of somebody not understanding how to run a murder investigation, how best to get information, and this is where we've ended up 130 years later.
Well, and how to engage new forms of media. The newspapers were newly important, and that's relevant to the Jack the Ripper case. Yeah. Where today we've had executive leadership stumble over social media, because they came up before social media was a big deal, and then now they're in executive leadership, and they're maybe not appreciating how important it is or how it could be used, and they've maybe missed a step or two. And so we've seen the same kind of thing happen. And if you wait another 30 years, it'll be something else where executive leadership may not be up to speed on how important something is.
Yeah, no, 100%, definitely. When you've got so little information, like there's not a lot of the paperwork left. Most of the original police files have been destroyed or taken as souvenirs by people. So there's not a lot left.
I was going to ask where those went. I didn't know if they were lost in a fire or just thrown away. Or
no. So what happens is all this paperwork gets sent off to like a big warehouse somewhere, and they run out of room. So what they do is they're like, well, what's the oldest case? What can we get rid of? That corner over there. We'll destroy that, and then that will create up some room so the new files can come in. And I think that's probably what's happened with the Jack the Ripper files, most of them. So what we've ended up with is mostly internal memorandum and reports to senior officers and stuff outlining what was going on in the case at the time. So we don't have witness statements and that book I was talking about where they're knocking door to door. We don't have that. We don't have those sorts of paperwork. So on the limited we have, where you keep seeing mistakes that may be made by the senior officers, you're thinking, well, in the tiny little window we've got of what's gone on where they're making mistakes, how many more have they? And so, for instance, Frederick Aberline, who was effectively the lead detective. So Charles Warren has put somebody above him, a chief inspector, Swanson, and said, "You're my eyes and ears on this. I want every single bit of paperwork to come through you, and no decision can be made unless they speak to you. But if it's an important decision, you have to come and speak to me." So essentially, the person that was leading the person that was leading it, the lead detective, couldn't make any decisions. And what he had to do is then go to this army officer who just clearly always made bad decisions to make his decisions for him. And anybody listening that's been involved in any kind of chain of command knows if you're the person doing the job, you have to be able to make your own decisions. If you have to defer everything up the chain, I mean, how does that work? It can't work.
It's horrible. It's a model doomed to failure.
Exactly. And when you see the failure, you can understand they created the environment for it to go wrong, because this senior officer wouldn't trust people to make their own decisions. He wanted to make the bad decisions for them, not them doing themselves.
Commissioner Warren is eventually replaced. He leaves, and he is replaced by Commissioner Monroe, who goes on to commit the most egregious thing in the entire book. I thought this is the biggest professional misstep in the entire book, and there were more than one. So can you tell me about Monroe's doctors?
Yeah, so to put it in perspective with the murders, so after the seventh murder, which was a lady by the name of Mary Jane Kelly, which was the most gruesome of all the murders. It was like when you saw the progression of Jack the Ripper's crimes, this was like the pinnacle of it.
The most mutilation and that.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. And when nowadays people talk about Jack the Ripper's crimes, they talk about 5 of them, generally known as the canonical 5. They're like historians, whoever it is, somewhere along the line have accepted that these are the 5 murders of Jack the Ripper. The 5th one of those is Mary Jane Kelly. And according to historians, people, whoever it is, Jack the Ripper didn't commit any more murders after this time. Coincidentally, on the day that Mary Jane Kelly was murdered, that first commissioner, Charles Warren, resigned, and they had to go and find a new one. Now, we all know, everybody listening to here will know, that the people at the top, when they're appointed, it's a political decision. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to be appointed at the top by politicians, as we do in the UK, that commissioner is appointed by the Home Secretary, a member of Parliament. They would have to have made certain promises that they would fulfill, whatever the problem was at that time. It happens now, it happened then. So what was the biggest issue in London in 1888? It was Jack the Ripper. So the incoming commissioner, undoubtedly, I've got no doubts whatsoever, would have to have made certain assurances. And to me, that would be we're going to catch him or we're going to stop him. Whatever happens, he's not going to commit any more murders, or we're going to catch him. So that's the background to Monroe coming in. So he's come in. The biggest issue is Jack the Ripper. The first murder that happens is a lady by the name of Rose Milet, and at first the police are treating it as a non-suspicious death. All deaths in the UK, unless somebody's been seen by a doctor within 7 days or something like that, or they a post-mortem or an autopsy will take place. And that's what happened here. And the pathologist carrying out the autopsy said, actually, this is murder. So when he went to the coroner's inquest, that is normal and happens within a couple of days, he said, yeah, this lady's been strangled. It's a murder. And the police are like, whoa, what are you talking about? This is non-suspicious. This isn't a murder.
We have a new commissioner. We don't have those anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially a prostitute in Whitechapel. Whitechapel murders cannot be associated anymore to Jack the Ripper. Right, so we need a second opinion. We can't rely on this doctor to say that this is a murder. So we'll get a second opinion. So they send the next doctor down, comes back and says, yeah, she's been strangled. It's a murder. Okay, well, we need a third opinion. Let's get another doctor down, and we'll send another doctor. Doctor comes back. Yes, she's been strangled. It's murder. Not liking this. Right, fourth opinion, please. Fourth doctor goes down. No, it's murder. Fifth doctor.
Wow.
Comes back. No, it's murder. Right, look, you've got to stop this. Right, fifth doctor, can you please go back? We don't think it's murder. We think something else has happened because the commissioner says, in my experience, and he was another military man, Monroe, he wasn't a police officer, this is what someone who's been strangled looks like. I've got bulging eyes, this, that, the other. Those doctors are all wrong. Can you go back and have a look? So the fifth doctor comes back and says, well, actually, I think it may have been an accident. She might have accidentally strangled herself. Yeah, we like that answer. So that's it. She's accidentally strangled herself. I'm reading, I'm thinking, wow. I mean, this is terrible.
It's a form of corruption to allow politics to steer an outcome. I mean, you got 6 opinions from 5 doctors.
Yeah.
Before you finally settled on the one you were wanting in the first place.
And you can dismiss all the others because they don't fit with your agenda.
Oh, that's horrible. Horrible.
And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, right, everything I'm doing, I'm coming with an open mind. I'm not being affected by previous people's opinions on what crimes he committed, who he may have been, etc. I'm coming at this as if it's a new investigation. As any murder investigation I come into, I have to come in with an open mind. And a detective's worst enemy is confirmation bias. And that's where you've already formed your mind on what's gone on. And then you start looking for information to support your own theory. And when you do that, it leads to miscarriages of justice and it leads to real murderers getting off. We've seen far too many cases of that in the UK where that's gone on. But this is like a classic example of it, isn't it? I've got all this information that it's a murder. I don't want that. I've got my idea of what's going on. This doctor must be right. And
it's horrible.
It's horrible.
The decision that we just aren't going to call this a Jack the Ripper murder anymore. I mean, you see that today where in some cities they'll reclassify a crime that was a felony down to a misdemeanor so they can reduce their felonies. Yeah. Well, the crimes are still happening.
Exactly.
But they've reclassified it. The politicians got involved and city council reclassified something or whatever.
100%, Jared, especially in the early 90s when I was policing then. So, for instance, in the area I policed, we had a problem with burglary, breaking entry or whatever. I don't know what you call it, but it's breaking into someone's home. So where somebody tried to break into their house and might have broken a window to try and get in, that would be an attempted burglary. But rather than call it that, we would call it a criminal damage to the window, which meant that it wasn't a burglary. So suddenly all the attempted burglaries were taken off the book. So the burglaries went down. And there was the same manipulation around robberies, around pickpocketing, reclassifying them. Yeah. So on paper, these crimes are going down, but the victims were still suffering. The crimes are still happening.
Oh, yeah.
And I see that playing out here. It's like, well, we've promised that we're either going to stop him or catch him. And by saying that this murder wasn't down to him, and I don't, in all honesty, I don't think this murder was down to him because the MO was completely different. But that's not the point. The point is that they were making sure no one was ever going to think it because it wasn't even a murder, which then has to cast serious doubt on everything that comes afterwards. And you can't help but read other people's opinions when you're researching this case, and a lot of them. So Monroe's deputy was a man called Robert Anderson, who was just as complicit in all this as Monroe. And a lot of people base when the murder stopped on what Anderson's opinion was. How can you trust his opinion? He had a vested interest that it was not. So
this is a city with 80 murders a year, a country with hundreds of murders a year, in a world with thousands and thousands of murders every year, and they just politically declared that Jack the Ripper's crimes had stopped.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
That's frustrating. Now, your book goes on to speak about that. It goes on to talk about who the different suspects are. So who was Jack the Ripper, actually?
Who was Jack the Ripper? Well, look, I use a method within my book to try and cut down on the number of, so there's like the favorites of the names that always get mentioned. And we use a method in the UK, we call it TIE. A list of people will be generated as suspects, and these will come from sort of people that were close to the scene, people that found the body, people with a grievance against a victim, a motive, people in the same area use a similar MO. So essentially what you're doing, you're generating a list of people where the suspect is likely to be on it. And then for a process of elimination, you get them down, and in an ideal world, you end up with one, the killer. In normal world, you end up maybe with two or three, or a few more, which then you can use other methods to look at, say arrests, surveillance,
I found that really interesting. It was kind of a way to score the suspects and give them a ranking or a score. How likely are they, or how unlikely are they?
Exactly. Yeah. And you're
not going to tell us. You're not going to tell us today.
Well, I've done that process, and I've got down to a couple. And there's one I favour, and that's not to say that he's definitely Jack the Ripper. What I'm saying is, of those suspects that people keep talking about, if he was one of them, this is the one that I favour. But you'd have to read the book to get that.
That's excellent. That's excellent, Steve. So again, the title of the book is Murder Investigation Team, Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
And it's going to be published this month, right? Here
20th of July. I'm not sure when this comes out, but 20th of July it's published.
Well, I'm going to buy a hard copy. I can't wait. I really enjoyed reading through the advanced copy. I'm eager to share it with other people.
When you put your heart and soul into something, you want people to enjoy it. But I know, having written my first book, not everybody is going to love what you write. But you're one of the first people to read it. So I'm so pleased that you enjoyed it. I really am.
Steve, thank you so much for talking to me today. This was really great. I appreciate it.
Thanks, mate. And listen, I could talk for hours on this subject because it's vast, it's huge, it's so interesting. And for me as a murder investigator to look at what went on in the past and compare it to now, it was a fascinating process for me. So thank you very much for inviting me on to speak about it. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Steve. Now, obviously, Stephen and his publisher didn't pay me anything to do this interview. They wouldn't have to. On Hey Chaplain, I'm only going to promote a book that I think a cop would want to read and would get something really meaningful from it. This is a book written by a cop in a way that a cop would appreciate, speaking to one of the most important episodes in the history of modern policing. So please go find Stephen's book. The link to it will be in the show notes. His Jack the Ripper book will be published on July 20th, 2023. Now, from time to time, I'm going to share a book from law enforcement history with you. In fact, I've got one coming up in about a month. And knowing the history of your profession is really important. But this book also offers something else. It shows you that a cop can be an effective communicator, so much so that he can be a success as an author after he retires from the force. And maybe you can do the same thing. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
The police somehow becomes the target. And at that time, it really didn't matter whether it was white policeman or black policeman or whatever, And I remember very vividly, standing with a black policeman, and they burned down his house. And I was standing outside his house with him, and I just sensed this tremendous pain, that he was experiencing, because somehow he was part of that thin blue line protecting, people from all of this, and he became a target.
If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain. And as always, pray for peace in our city.